Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plotlines. I'm your host, Connor, and today is a special day for this podcast. Not only do we have a great guest on this episode, we also have a co-host, John Kane. John Kane is a Marine and a good friend. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Connor. Good to be on here.
Our guest today is Dr. Jared Stout. Dr. Stout is a doctor of systematic theology. He is an associate professor at the St. Augustine Institute. We are here to discuss beer and Catholicism, and Dr. Stout is perfect because he wrote a book called The Beer Option. Thank you for coming on the show, Dr. Stout.
Yeah, it's great to be with you. It's always fun to talk about beer.
It is.
Absolutely.
And I believe John and I will be joining the beer, the beer fun with our own beers here. And I assume you will not be joining because it's Lent.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Taking the hard road here.
I think we picked a bad time in the liturgical calendar, maybe, for this.
Well, there is that tradition of the monks who did the beer fast, although I do try to straighten that out in my book. The Friars Minim, so they were like the most intense fasting group of the Franciscans, founded by St. Francis Paula.
Word from our affiliate, Bishop Sheen Rosaries. You've probably worn through the chain of your cheap plastic rosary. Other rosaries simply can't stand up to the wear and tear of everyday life. Bishop Sheen rosaries are made of solid metal beads and paracord to withstand any condition, and are backed with a lifetime warranty. Upgrade your rosary to a Bishop Sheen rosary made to fit your lifestyle, or buy one for a friend. Each rosary sold supplies 2 weeks of food for a school kid in Uganda. You use the exclusive link down below to help support our efforts here at Plotlines. The link will take you to sheenrosaries.com. Be sure to use the code Plotlines10.
They actually did the Lenten fast the whole year. And the traditional Lenten fast was only eating one meal a day and no animal products throughout the Middle Ages and before. And so they actually started brewing beer just to help sustain them during the day. But then the tradition grew up that they were only drinking beer during Lent, but that's actually not true. It was just to help them with their strong Lenten fasting.
Gotcha. I believe it's also common for monks to not eat until sunset. Is that?
Yeah, that's right. So even in the rule of St. Benedict, it talks about that, but that is the traditional Lenten fast. So all Christians in the early church did that fast. And that's actually where Ramadan comes from. They were just imitating Lent.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So then over time, that one meal a day kind of got bumped up, and sometimes people even put in a little snack called a collation during the day. But the monks would not eat until after Vespers. So they moved up the 3 o'clock prayer, which was called noon. They moved that up to midday. That's actually where we get the word noon from. It's actually noon being moved up to what would now, speak of as noon, 12 o'clock. And then they would pray Vespers, and then they would eat. So they during Lent, they just kind of moved up the evening to be early afternoon.
Yeah. I think a lot of our listeners and watchers are going to sort of want a basic, more sort of morality of drinking alcohol / beer, because there's a lot of misconceptions, and and then there's a lot of people who take beer way too far. So how would you set that up for us?
Well, sin is essentially a misuse of a good, right? And you can think about that a number of perspectives, but even like our sexuality, right? It's good, right? The sexual act, which we traditionally call the marital act, right? It's good. And what we see with sin is when this good thing is misdirected and misused. And we can think of that for a lot of other sins, but obviously when it comes to alcohol, the Bible says that it's good. And there's more wine in the Bible than beer, but even the Psalms say wine to gladden the heart of man. But beer is in the Bible. And you might think, well, wait a second, I don't see it there. But it's actually called strong drink. They didn't have liquor in the Old Testament times. That wasn't made until the 1400s.
Mhm.
So when it says wine and strong drink, for some reason, these, I guess, maybe snooty Bible translators didn't want to translate it beer. So they thought strong drink was better. But the Hebrew word is shakar. And even like the Mesopotamian word for beer was sikaru. So sikaru to shakar. The Israelites made beer just by soaking twice baked loaves of barley in a tub and just letting it sit. They might put honey or fruit in there because those things have yeast. They didn't know what yeast was, but they knew that if you put those things in, that it would actually ferment better. And then they would drink that with straws. So that was very common throughout the ancient Near East and Egypt, right? So that's how they made beer. And shakar was actually part of the daily Israelite offering to God. Wine was as well. So wine and beer were actually poured out before the altar as a libation. So yeah, beer is there in the Old Testament, and it is meant to be used well. And actually, it's meant to be used to honor God, right? Every good thing in the world is meant to be used to honor God. And it becomes sinful. Well, the thing doesn't become sinful. The use of it becomes sinful when we're turning it away from honoring God, from promoting health and relationship and what these things that are supposed to happen, and turn it towards a more selfish purpose. And so, when we drink too much alcohol, I think really it's a kind of escape. We're escaping from reality or even from morality, right? Because people say, well, just drink and then we can do whatever, right? Eat, drink, and be merry, whatever. And but so it's a laying down of our responsibilities, checking out of reality, and it's pulling away from relationships to God and to other people, right? Because when you get drunk, you're usually not a very nice person to be around. And so we have to use everything that God has given us and the things that we make in culture for the right reasons, right? Rather than distorting them.
Absolutely. I was just curious I wondered, what are ways that we can encourage our peers around us, especially in America, where the culture is heavily based around drinking to get drunk. What are ways that we can drink responsibly and encourage those around us to do the same?
Well, in the book, I have like an appeal to parents, teach your children how to drink.
Right.
I say children, right? But, even, I'm not saying they're teeny tiny, but,
Right.
you give kids on holy days and feast days, you give them a little drink and it demystifies it, right?
Mhm.
Drinking has been a regular part of Catholic culture throughout all of our history. And in America, and I think it's because we live in a more Protestant culture,
Mhm.
it's become like a taboo, right? Even with prohibition, for those years where we were trying to get rid of alcohol altogether, to say it's bad, stay away from it, don't do it. I said, no, rather drink with your kids. And so, well, that's illegal. Well, actually, in most states, it isn't. There are a few where it is, but so I'm really sorry if you live in one of those states, but like Utah is one of them.
Oh yeah.
But almost
Mormons.
every state, it is legal to consume alcohol with your kids in your own house. And there's even some states like Wisconsin and Louisiana where you can actually drink publicly with your own kids.
Right. In like
So
restaurants.
teach your kids how to drink. And then I would say these are my general principles for Catholic drinking: feasting, fasting, friendship.
Mhm.
Feasting, right? That we drink, as Chesterton said, not because we're sad, right? We drink because we're happy. That is, we're drinking for the right reasons, and that's where it comes back to honoring God.
Mhm.
We have these great feast days, and there was even an early church father that commanded his monks to have a drink every Sunday. He said, because you have to celebrate the Lord's Day. And so when you read like Joseph Pieper's book, In Tune with the World, A Theory of Festivity, he says, well, that's how Catholics celebrated the feast days. You go to mass, but then the celebration continues with eating, drinking, singing, dancing, music, all of these things. That's actually a big reason why we drink. We're drinking to celebrate, right? We're not saying the world is bad. We want to get away from it. We're saying the world is good. But then fasting, and of course, here we are in Lent. Now, I know you guys are drinking right now, but but fasting is, making sure that we don't get too attached to the good things of the earth. And so we want to make sure that, we're not drinking to excess, we're not getting too dependent. The church gives us every Friday as a day of penance, right? And actually Friday is a big party night. So maybe it's a good day to say, well, on Fridays I don't drink,
Yeah.
or Advent and Lent, these seasons of penance, to say, I'm giving it up, taking a step back. And I think that can be a really good thing. But then friendship, like I said, if you go to, like one of these stupid parties, go to a frat house or whatever, it's not real friendship, right? And so I think that what I've seen throughout my life is just sitting down with other guys and talking, having real camaraderie with a beer, right? It draws us together. You see these men's groups, and people always, tell me at parishes, well, we can't get guys to come. And I said, well, have beer and, smoke pipes, tobacco pipes, right? You get guys there. So those are my principles: feasting, fasting, friendship, and, don't sin, and that's a big question. Some people say, is it a sin to get drunk? Right. And the answer is clearly yes. I mean, Paul lists it as one of the sins that can keep you from entering the kingdom of God in his letters. He mentions that a couple of times. And the reason why is because we are spiritual beings, right? And the main spiritual acts that we have are our reasoning and our free will. And when we impair those, obviously we lose control. And we say, well, I was drunk, I didn't know I was doing that. Yeah, but you chose to get drunk.
Right.
And so you chose to impair the highest faculties that you have, the most important elements of who you are. Right. And so it's a sin to do that. It is harmful to you on both the physical level, spiritual level, and you are culpable for all the things you did when you were drunk because you chose to get drunk.
Right.
I think it's according to Aquinas that drinking or getting drunk for the first time is not a sin, at least because I think he says because you don't know what it is to be drunk until you have gotten drunk. And I thought, I mean, the sin, I always thought that the sin is not what you do if you get drunk, it's that you got drunk.
Yes, but I'm saying, yeah, because you chose to do that, then you're responsible for what happens after. That's what I mean. Yeah, your reason's impaired, and that's the problem. So yeah, you're not in your right mind always. Now, in that case, it's like if someone accidentally got drunk because they didn't know how to drink, right? That's one thing because it wasn't intentional. But it's not like, oh, well, the first time, here's a free card, just go ahead and go at it because it's not a sin the first time. No, that's not what Aquinas is saying.
Definitely. No, yeah.
But yeah, so if you don't understand your limit and you accidentally, you make a mistake, and okay, but Aquinas says that it's okay to drink to hilarity. That is not like you're falling off your seat, but he said it's okay to drink until you feel good, right? But not to the point of losing control of reason.
Yeah, I think you brought it up that we live in a country built by Protestants. What would you say that, or how would you sort of say that, like, what do Puritanical Protestants get wrong about alcohol?
There always is a temptation to say, well, people are abusing this thing, so let's get rid of that thing. And there's a quote attributed to Luther, which I don't think this is exactly appropriate. So don't attribute this to me. I'm just going to quote him, right? Women can lead us into sin, but we don't get rid of women, right? And he was directly, speaking about alcohol, right? And making a comparison there, and of course he had his famous table talks with beer, right? He'd gather his students together and they would talk over the table. And he was a real German, right? So he liked his beer, and his wife actually brewed beer. I'm not a fan of Luther, by the way, and you can see that in the book. But anyway, he gives a different perspective. But yeah, Aquinas says that, right, following Aristotle, virtue is in the middle, right? So if you drink to excess, he says that, well, obviously that's a sin, but can there be a defect? And he says, well, yes, if you saw drinking to be good for you and your health, and you specifically didn't do it. Now we know that, right? It's not that we actually have to drink or something, but he was sort of putting that out there as a hypothetical. And I think that does kind of represent the defect of just saying you can't drink, right? That would be the defect, to say, no, it's not permissible because it could be used in excess. But I mean, literally, if you drink too much water, it will kill you, right? So what we have to do is build up virtue. And so we have the virtue of temperance, which is moderation, right? So it helps us to be in the middle when it comes to bodily desires. And that's, how we're able to use alcohol well. But what ends up happening when you have that puritanical kind of view that just wants to get rid of anything that could be an occasion for sin, what does it do? It leads actually to the overreaction. And so, if you look at like a Catholic custom of the beer garden, what that was is families going to mass and then going home and getting like a picnic basket and then going and sitting in a beer garden outside the brewery and drinking beer. Everyone, right? Even the kids in moderation. And
Right.
and you said, okay, when I see that, like families gathering together to drink on the Lord's Day, that's probably how you're supposed to do it, right? Not going to some party where everyone's drinking excess, or not being puritanical. And some Protestants on the Lord's Day would say you have to just sit in your house and do nothing, right? Say, no, we get families outside and celebrating and really enjoying this day together in a way that honors God. Now, however, if you have recognized that alcohol is an occasion of sin, that it really is a problem in your life, well then, yeah, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. And you really should avoid alcohol if it is a moral or physical problem for you.
Yeah. So my understanding is that you are a Benedictine Oblate. Is that correct?
Yes.
What does it mean to be a Benedictine Oblate?
So the Benedictines are not actually in an order the same way that, say, the Franciscans or Dominicans are. Most monasteries are actually independent, and freestanding. And there might be a confederation of monasteries, but the abbot is even like the bishop for his community. So they're independent. So if you become like a secular Franciscan or Dominican, you're joining a third order that is really worldwide. But if you want to become a Benedictine as a layman like myself, you join one particular monastery, right? You're not joining some worldwide group, just one monastery. And the word oblate just means like an offering. So you make it like an offering of yourself to God by joining yourself to that community. So I'm an oblate at Our Lady of Clear Creek, Abbey in Oklahoma. And so I unite my prayer and my work to the prayer and the work of the monks. So it's really a spiritual reality. There are practices that I do. I read from the Rule of St. Benedict every day with a commentary for oblates. I pray the divine office, right? The liturgy of the hours, parts of it at least, because I have 6 kids, right? So that keeps me busy and a few jobs. And then, practice Lectio Divina with spiritual reading. And but why I was drawn to the Benedictines is it's the same reason I wrote this book, is that I believe very strongly that we need to live out our faith through culture, through a whole way of life, saturated with our faith. And so the monks, for me, are a model of Catholic culture, because it's not like they pray all the time. They do pray a lot, but even at Clear Creek, the abbot said, we sleep 8 hours, we pray 8 hours, we work 8 hours. And so they have a great balance, but they do a lot of things there, right? So, Clear Creek has cattle, they grow some of their own food, right? They make cheese, they have workshops, and I'm really drawn to that. And beer was actually part of it, right? I've always enjoyed monastic beer. And, as I, discovered a lot of the monastery beers, like by the Trappists, who are actually a group of Benedictines, right? They're a particular, the Cistercians, who are Reformed Benedictines, and then Trappists, who are Reformed Cistercians, but they're all part of the Benedictine family. So when I was experiencing these beers like Chimay and others, I just started learning the history. And lo and behold, it turns out the reason we're not drinking beer out of straws, like the ancient Israelites, is because the monks perfected brewing as we know it, right? So rather than just creating that kind of mush in a tub, right? We soak malted barley to create what we call wort, and then we boil it and put in hops to flavor it. It was the monks who really fine-tuned a lot of the brewing equipment and the process, and they were the first ones to put hops into beer in northern France. And so it was really amazing getting into that history and to say, all right, so the monks are not only teaching us about how to live Catholic culture, but they're also showing us how to integrate things like beer within that culture. And so, why did I write a book about beer? It could be a book about anything, right? How do we integrate the good things of life and culture into a Christian way of life, right? That's what I'm really after. And so it's like, if we can do it with beer, we can do it with anything, right? Let's get this right. And then we can get everything else right too.
Yeah. Did you say the Our Lady of Clear Creek, do they make beer?
They do make beer. They don't sell beer, but one of the monks brews, and they have it 1 or 2 days a week, I think, depending on the time of year. So just with like their lunch.
Is it good beer?
Yeah. So it's the one time I had it there, it was like a monastery double style. So like a Belgian style, like you'd see in a lot of other monastery beers.
Is that similar to Blue Moon? Because that's a Belgian, or is that different?
That is different. So for like a monastery double, I would recommend, well, you're going to like birranursia.com, BIRRANURSIA.com, Birra Nursia. There's American monks in St. Benedict's hometown of Norcia, Italy. It was called Nursia when St. Benedict was born there. And they have a brewery. So you can actually, even though it's made in Italy, you can buy it over here, and it's very good. So their dark beer is like in the double style. And that'd probably be the one I'd recommend trying. But if you go to a decent liquor store, you can generally find, well, the most common Trappist beer I've already mentioned is Chimay. That's CHIMAY. And their red is a double, but their blue is a Belgian strong ale, which is one of my favorites. So those would be some good beers to try for that style. So they're darker, maltier, higher alcohol than that beer you're drinking there.
Yeah, water basically.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are beers that are more like water than Blue Moon, but on the spectrum,
Right.
you need to try some of these strong monastic beers.
Yeah. I remember the first beer I ever had, my dad, he let us drink when we were 18, but he put some ground rules, like only under my roof, and you're not going out afterwards or anything. I remember the first beer I had was a milk stout, pretty dark malty beer. It was a hard pour. That's why I loved it. Just watching the beer cascade down.
Yeah.
But I kind of loathe not living in Europe or close to these countries where they brew these really dark malties, like sometimes sweet beers.
Mm-hmm.
And like, in America, those aren't the beers that people drink.
Yeah, my first beer was in Poland. I was an exchange student in high school. And I was actually in the medieval town hall of Wrocław, Poland. And they had a brewery and restaurant down in the basement level of this beautiful building. And so we had a really nice meal, and it was the kind of beer that you were just describing, and so here I was, a teenager, but this is how I got started, right? Not just like so many people just pounding Bud Light or whatever, but it really was this amazing cultural experience.
Right.
And I was hooked on good beer right from
Right.
the beginning. I wasn't interested in, any kegers or anything like that.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Once you taste the best of the best, it's hard to just start drinking water at that point.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that stuff's not beer.
Yeah. Our Lady of Clear Creek Abbey. Will you speak to sort of how that got started? I've heard of it before, and a few of my friends visited Clear Creek before. I find that it has a very interesting origin.
Yeah, to say the least. So there was a really impactful professor at the University of Kansas. So this is a state school. And he, along with two other professors, started an integrated humanities program where you could fulfill, initially at least, some of your core requirements in your first 2 years. So it was John Senior. And if you haven't heard of him, I really recommend his book, The Restoration of Christian Culture. And this program, the Pearson Integrated Humanities Program, a lot of times just shortened IHP, Integrated Humanities Program, led to over 200 conversions in 10 years of students to the Catholic faith. What did they do? Well, I mean, they read the great books together. Rather than philosophical type books, they read a lot of narrative books, so literature, they memorized poetry, and the professors would just come, the three of them, just sit up in the front and talk about them. And the students were just kind of like entering into their conversation. And so they memorized poetry, they sang folk songs, they learned conversational Latin, they went stargazing, they had country fairs, they had waltzes with live music. They would spend sometimes, well, either a summer trip or a whole semester in Europe. And it was just transformational. And it was a state school. So the teachers were not just like, saying, hey, you all need to be Catholic. They just started thinking about the great things of life. And then they would come to the professors and say, well, what about God? And they would just say, well, what do you want to talk about? And they would just answer their questions. And so the students themselves just were being led to God, and then they started leading each other, and it was a really beautiful process. Archbishop Coakley in Oklahoma City went through IHP, Bishop Conley in Lincoln, but so did about 8 of the monks at Clear Creek. Dr. Senior actually took them to a monastery in France called Fongambeau, and Bishop Conley even entered there for a time, or at least thought about it, spent some time there. And the abbot at Fongambeau said, we're being invaded by Americans, because so many IHP students. And so 8 of them, kind of persisted, right? There was actually dozens there at a time, but 8 of them persisted and became monks in France. This actually led to lawsuits against the University of Kansas, because some of these students had been Protestant or even Jewish. And so their parents were freaking out. I sent my kid to the University of Kansas and now they're a monk in France, I mean, they literally sued,
Wow.
the University of Kansas. So in the year 2000, Fongambeau in France said, all right, we're going to send you Americans back home. And so the monastery founded Clear Creek. It was in the Diocese of Tulsa, which very graciously worked with the monastery. And it's still, within the kind of home region of a lot of the monks, right? Because they were going to the University of Kansas. And so it's really become a beautiful place of culture in the fullest sense that prayer is the height of culture that organizes our life. And as I mentioned, they have a lot of great agricultural practices there. And so a lot of people have been impacted just by visiting.
You said that they went to, or you said they went to France and got trained there, or at least, and then were sent back. Are they still like, you said also that Benedictines don't really necessarily have as much of a structure between different abbeys. Is there still a structure there, or are they completely separate?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Benedictine monasteries are grouped into like federations, or we call congregations. So Fongambeau is part of the Salem congregation. So you may know the Abbey of Salem because it's famous for Gregorian chant. So Salem sent monks to Fongambeau. So what happens is that when a monastery reaches a certain size, it will then split and it'll make a foundation of another monastery. So Benedictines do actually take a vow of stability to stay in the monastery for life. And there are exceptional moments like that when a monastery will found another monastery, and then under obedience, the monks will actually have to leave. And so Fongambeau, has actually founded, I think, about at least 5 male monasteries. So 3 or 4 in France, and then Clear Creek, because they've grown so much, because they're following the traditional Benedictine way of life, what we call the orarium. And so they're being faithful to the rule and the traditional Benedictine office as set out in the rule of praying all the Psalms, and they have traditional liturgy and chant. So it's been very attractive. And so it was founded in the year 2000, as I mentioned, as a priory And so that means that the prior, who is Dom Philip Anderson, was underneath the abbot of Fougambeau. But once Clear Creek grew to a self-sustaining level, it then became its own independent, self-governing abbey, which is what it is now. So it's no longer a priory, it became an abbey with its own abbot. And they have grown from the 12 monks who showed up in the year 2000 to over 50 monks now. So just in a little over 20 years. So it's pretty remarkable growth. And they're actually building a whole nother wing of the monastery right now.
That's incredible. Yeah. So getting back to more about beer, do you have any strategies for drinking smartly? Outside of like just avoiding getting drunk, but like just going about drinking.
Yeah, so some people have suggested not drinking alone, and I think that yes, that does make sense, because then we're more tempted to just kind of use it as this escape to kind of check out, and et cetera. So I would say, don't drink alone and avoid drinking parties. And rather, I would say, drink with a group of friends, and know your limit. So I'm a short guy. I don't weigh very much. So for me, it's usually 2 beers. I'm done. Maybe a third, if it's over a longer period of time and I'm eating
Right.
food, whatever. 3 beers, fine. There are guys that weigh twice what I do, and so they can drink a lot more than me. So yeah, know your limit and be firm about that, because what happens is you start drinking and then you just keep drinking, right?
Right.
Because your resolve is kind of worn down. So I would say, know already, this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to be firm with that. And maybe you have a buddy there and you can say, hey, make sure I don't have more than 3 beers. Okay, can you help keep me honest here? And maybe he wants you to do the same for him. And yeah, so you have to know what maybe your near occasions are. Okay, if I'm going to this person's house, I know that this guy likes to drink too much, and maybe I'm going to be pulled into that, so I'm not going to go. Or if I drink by myself, I might just keep drinking, whatever. So I'm not going to do that. So it's good to know yourself, have a spiritual director. That's a good thing in general, right? And if you don't have a spiritual director, you can even just ask a priest for kind of counsel and confession, and just to say, I mean, even if you're not necessarily falling into sin, but I'm really trying to grow in this area. Does this make sense? Like what I'm thinking of doing to try to avoid sin in this area. So I would come back, feasting, fasting, friendship. I do recommend that people have periodic breaks, and I do think that either Advent and or Lent are a good time for a break. But it's good, and not just with alcohol, but with other things too. Technology, or if we're eating too much or whatever it is, to say, I'm going to take a period of prayer and fasting. And once again, the church is kind of laying it out for us right now. Lent is meant to be a 40-day fast. Like I said, it used to be 1 meal a day. But I think that means that we should change the way that we eat during Lent. Doesn't mean that, we're giving up food altogether, but maybe you don't eat meat throughout the whole 40 days like they used to. Used to be no animal products, as I mentioned. Or I'm going to skip breakfast, or I know we tend to give up I'm going to give up chocolate, but, it could be I'm giving up something more substantial, or alcohol or whatever it is. So I think that is really important, to have these more intense times of prayer and fasting when we pull back from other things, and especially technology. I'll put that out there again. I think that technology is designed to addict us. And, if you're addicted to technology use, which most of us are, and you're struggling with drinking, that's a bad combination too, right? In terms of avoiding the near occasions of sin. So it's very important to be guarded, to know yourself, and to have a spiritual guide, whether it's spiritual director, but it could also just be a good friend. We're going to check in, make sure that our habits are in line with the use of technology and with drinking and with prayer, and that my life is ordered, and I have that kind of spiritual accountability partner.
I love that you talk about accountability, because I think in general, with any sort of addiction or problem, especially like habitual sins in your life, that accountability factor really helps along the way. And I think, these things like technology and alcohol are designed to make us feel lonely and separate us from others. So I love that you mentioned that.
Yeah, I don't know if you've heard of Exodus 90, but
Oh,
it is
absolutely.
that. Yeah, right. So that 90-day period of you give up alcohol, and of course the cold showers is what everybody always talks about. But and so you're pulling back on technology and social media, but maybe the most important part of it is the time of prayer
Mhm.
and then the fellowship
Brotherhood.
with other men,
Yeah,
because that's what makes it work, right?
right.
If you just gave up stuff, that doesn't lead you into the heart of it, right? It
Right.
really is that you're growing through prayer, you're growing in friendship with other men, and then you are practicing that asceticism, right? That discipline,
Mhm.
which is so important. And I found this in a number of different ways, that sacrifice opens up grace, right? So sacrificing things that we're attached to opens up just whole new paths of prayer and grace in our lives.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Are you familiar with the story of, I think, Doppelbock beer?
Yes.
Like,
And it's related to what I said about the monastic fast. So um, the original Doppelbock um, is from that Pauliner brewery in Munich.
Mm.
And so the Paul and the Pauliner stands for Saint Francis Paola, who founded the Friars Minimum. And when you get a Pauliner like the Salvator, that's the original Doppelbock, right? And you look at the cap or on the label of a Pauliner, there is Saint Francis Paola,
Mhm.
right? So even though it was secularized under Napoleon, so a couple hundred years ago, it became a secular brewery, no longer run by the Franciscans. But so that's that beer, like which I mentioned, that the Friars Minimum developed to sustain them in their fasting. So that's the origin of the Doppelbock. There's a great story that the Pope heard that the monks were using beer to supplement them in their fasting. And he said, well, they need to send some of that to me. And so the story is, there it is. It's just being hauled probably by, donkey or whatever. And so it's being shaken up and it's just sitting in the sun as it's, the barrels are going over the Alps. And by the time it gets to Rome, it's spoiled. And so the Pope sips some of it. And he says, oh my gosh, if the monks want to use that for fasting, let them go ahead,
They got away with a fast one there.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, what is your favorite Doppelbock?
Well, I would say definitely the Salvator, which I mentioned, which means the Savior.
Mhm.
And so with a history like that, you really can't go wrong. I wish the Franciscan friars were still making it, the Friars Minimum. But nonetheless, it's the original, and it has that amazing history. So it would be probably the beer they were sending over the mountains in that story. So
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, how can you go wrong? So yeah, try Pauliner Salvator.
Yeah, I would love to at some point. So do you brew beer?
I have, yeah. So and
Okay.
it was a lot of fun. I've done it in the house, and the kids got involved and everything. I actually lost my brewing equipment in a bad mold experience that we had in a
Oh,
rental.
darn.
So I don't have it anymore. But nonetheless, I brew with some of my friends, and I've actually even been a part of a parish brewing experience. And so yes, I have brewed a number of times, and it really is a lot of fun.
Do you pray for the success of your beer?
Well, we have to bless everything, right? Now in the book I mentioned that there was a deacon who actually wanted to brew beer with holy water and say, okay, no, that's taking things too far, right? Because we don't use holy things for mundane purposes. But
Mhm.
nonetheless, we can sprinkle holy water on the beer. There's nothing wrong with that, to bless it, right? That's what we use holy water for blessing. And actually, that is where the book came from. Is I was asked to give a talk about beer. I don't even know how that happened, but anyway, I gave a Theology on Tap talk about beer,
That's
and
perfect.
I took the official blessing for beer from the Roman ritual, and I used that as the basis of my talk. And so I said, this is like the catechesis of beer, is this Roman ritual book. And so yes, we pray for our beer. There's even an official blessing from the church, and that says something,
Mhm.
that the
Certainly.
church actually
That's it.
includes that. in its own ritual. So I have it even just right in the introduction to the book, because I still kind of use that to open everything up.
Yeah.
And so this is it, just if you haven't heard it. Bless, O Lord, this creature beer, which thou hast deigned to produce from the fat of grain, that it may be a salutary remedy to the human race, and grant through the invocation of thy holy name, that whosoever shall drink it may gain health in body and peace in soul through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Yeah.
And so, the church is definitely recognizing there that beer can promote our physical and spiritual good. It's not to say that it can't do the opposite. We all know that it can, but that's part of the blessing. May this be something that really conduces to your physical and spiritual good for the honor of God. And I think it's interesting that the blessing says that God has produced this, right? Even though, of course, we're the ones brewing it, but it's still recognizing beer as a blessing that comes from God.
Yeah. I mean, you would say brewing beer makes you or draws you closer to God.
Well, I have a whole chapter on home brewing. And what I say in the book is that God gave us a cultural mission. When you think of Genesis 1, he made us in his image and likeness, but it says, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over creation, right? And we see at the beginning of Genesis 2 that Adam is tilling within the garden. So God wants us to take up the good things of creation and to enhance them through our work. And so I wouldn't necessarily say that brewing automatically brings you closer to God,
Sure.
but I would say it's like the same principles, right? That you're brewing something that you want to contribute to kind of the building up of culture within your family and with your friends. You want to use it for festivity, right? To honor God. You're going to bless it, maybe have a priest come and bless it. And you're exercising that dominion over creation, right? You literally can see that malted barley in your hand, right? There's the hops. I'm making it. I'm producing something. I'm not just going to the store. And there is something spiritual about that. So I'm not going to say that either making beer or drinking beer automatically will do that, but if we do whatever we do rightly, it should bring us closer to God, whether it's brewing or making dinner for your family or your work, your leisure and recreation, right? All of that should bring you closer to God when it's rightly ordered.
Yeah, exactly. Order and disorder are the primary, distinctions between good and evil.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have any sort of ideas for how Catholics can begin to take over the beer industry?
Well, I know a number of Catholic guys who brew. It is a difficult market to get into. Before Prohibition, there were 4,000 breweries in the United States. And then, I would say, a couple hundred maybe opened up after Prohibition. But by 1979, there were only 40 breweries left in the whole country. 40. I mean, there's probably more than 40 in Denver right now. So we're back up to 4,000 breweries again, or maybe even more, because it's been a few years since I checked. So, probably over 4,000 breweries. So it is hard for Catholics to get into that. But this is what I would recommend. I even know some guys who just started brewing for Knights of Columbus events at their parish. And then eventually that did grow into a whole nother brewery. And so I think that something like that would be great. Just brewing for the Catholic community. Maybe brewing for parish events for different parishes, or having like a young adult event or an Oktoberfest. I did a really great, a couple actually. I've done 2 beer and food pairings, and just a number of evangelization events around beer. I've done a beer retreat, right, where it was more than just drinking, I promise. But
Are you
but
sure?
we, obviously had time for prayer, and he had talks, and I drew from the book and everything. But all I'm saying is there's a lot that we can do with beer, and I know there's even some Catholics who are even trying to create even kind of economic spaces where we might have a pregnancy center and a restaurant and like shared office space for Catholic groups. And so I think there are a lot of possibilities if we're creative. And I'm actually working with a group in Denver that we want to acquire some land outside of Denver and maybe have a residential community, an apostolate, and maybe some businesses kind of all working together. And so, hey, stay tuned. Maybe there can be a sequel to the beer option. But I think just opening up a brewery, it is hard. It's an uphill battle unless you're in an area that's not saturated. I guess it's definitely saturated where I am. So.
Yeah, makes sense. So what is the spiritual focus of a beer retreat?
Yeah, so I mean, not surprisingly, it was geared for men, you know.
Mhm.
And so I like to say, raise a glass together, and then it's time to put down your beer, right? And engage in battle. And so, when I give a kind of spiritual talk or groups of talks on beer, it really is how men can kind of gather together to build community and culture. But then there comes a time, right? We got to put down our beer, roll up our sleeves. And I really think that, of course, men are more drawn to beer than women. There are many women who like beer, right? But nonetheless, you do a beer event, you're gonna have probably more men who come. And so, the beer option is about more than beer, right? It's about understanding, as we were saying, ordering your life rightly, building community, doing things with your hands, like making beer, really having our work honor God, building, kind of even local community, like I was saying, economically. And so just introducing some of these ideas to men, but then also talking about what men need to do in our culture beyond beer, right? That we need to fight for what is right. We need to protect people who need to be protected, the vulnerable and people who are being exploited. And men are not doing their job in our culture right now. And I think a lot of men feel like they can't, right? We're kind of coward a bit. And there's a lot of threats, and masculinity is now considered toxic. And yeah, of course, there can be a bad expression of masculinity, but it seems like when people talk about toxic masculinity, they're just talking about masculinity, right? And so we need to help Catholic men just to recover what it means to be a Catholic man, and really to embrace even the call to family life, because a lot of young Catholics aren't getting married. And so just to put it out there that and I got pushback on this, but so I'll explain why. But I said, the most important thing you can do as a young man right now is to get married and raise a family, and to really raise your kids well, keep them from the crap in the culture, help them to form virtue, and to be ready to go out and build culture in the world. Now, somebody said, well, the most important thing, well, what about, the vocation of the priesthood? And I said, well, yeah, okay. With that caveat, right, that some of us are called, to this spiritual mission in the church, but I would say all men have a priestly mission, whether it's going to be in the ordained priesthood or is it to the priesthood of the home, right? Because if the home's a domestic church, we really need men to embrace the spiritual authority that God has given them as father in the home. And there's a book, this is kind of deviating from the beer option, but called The Collapse of Parenting. And the book is by Leonard Sachs. He says parents think they're doing a good job when they let their kids do whatever they want, but that actually makes their kids to become unhappy. And that the number one thing that kids need to be happy is discipline. Well, who is the one who needs to give discipline to the kids, teach them to pray? We know that fathers, and this has been studied extensively sociologically, have much more influence on the spiritual life of their kids than mothers. And so, hey, I mean, don't be angry at me if there's any women out there listening to this, because that, like I said, even on a secular level, that's been studied, and it just is the reality. Mm-hmm. And so men need to take up their tasks of leadership in the church, in the home, and in our society.
Yeah, you can't be angry that God created a system the way he's created it.
Yeah, and there's a beautiful complementarity. I mean, Paul says, be subject to one another out of love of Christ, right? And that's this complementarity, this partnership that of being a helpmate to one another. But then he says, wives, be subordinate to your husbands. Mm-hmm. And so there's an equality in the relationship, but the husband still has a spiritual role, this kind of priestly, authoritative role in the family. He's a spiritual authority. And I think a lot of men maybe are uncomfortable with that, or they've been made to feel uncomfortable. And we have to take that back up because, our families are suffering so greatly. And the
Yeah.
church is suffering because our families are suffering.
Right.
Even I would say that's shown very much in sort of the hierarchy as well within the clergy too, is if, it almost seems to scare priests to take on their ordered role as being like priests offering up, the sacrifice of the mass for the congregation. Instead, they, want to invite their congregation into like almost like participating is not a good word for it, but sort of like co-sacrificing in the sense of like they're on the altar, they're sort of as if there's not a difference in the order of clergy versus laity.
Well, look at this, what's been in the news recently, this incident of baptism, where the
Right.
priest didn't want to say, I baptize you. So instead he said, we baptize you. And it's invalid because the I, it's not about you. It's about Jesus. And so you hear priests say, may the Lord bless us. No, you've been given the spiritual authority. Or you are in persona Christi. I baptize you, and may Almighty God bless you, which he says with authority, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, give me a break.
There's a tradition that I would like to see brought back is, I've noticed at some traditional Latin masses where the congregation will bow to the priest as he enters, and then as he exits.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it really shows sort of, I recognize you, that you are in persona Christi, and you are about to do something for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And, people are afraid of, kind of clericalism creeping back in the church. And, we don't have to have that, right? We don't have to have this improper clericalism in which everything is about the priest and the priest is on some exalted level and can never do anything wrong. And he's the only one who ever makes decisions for the parish, I mean, lay people do need to step up and help with especially practical things in the parish. And the priest cannot do everything himself. But when we look at the role of offering the sacrifice and leading the sacramental life, it is right to honor Christ, through the priest.
Yeah. As you said, Aquinas says that virtue is in the middle. You
Right.
can't have that. I think some people have called it more like clerical fascism or something like that, to differentiate between sort of, my understanding is there's a good term or a good definition of clericalism, if I'm not mistaken. And then sort of so middle ground between the laity is doing everything, and then on the other side, the priest has, this
Authority, right?
fascistic, sort of, what is it, fascistic way of
Well,
handling.
clerical fascism, just so you know, does refer to an historical incident of priests leading fascist regimes in between the world wars. So anyway, we can use it in other ways, but it does have that historical connotation.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, we recognize the authority of the priest. We honor his sacramental role, but we need to do things to serve the church, right? And we're not just we can't as lay people just wash our hands and say, well, the priest will do it, or he's the one in charge. And, that's part of the reason that things are so bad in the church too, is because we were not holding clergy accountable.
Yeah. Well, also, when you don't help out the priest, men will not be there to become priests.
Yeah.
It's like when you lose male altar servers, you basically lose vocations.
Yeah, I think it's true.
But yeah, do you have anything you want to say sort of generally about how beer should be used, how we should go about our lives with moderation regarding beer?
Well, I think what I would say, since we've hit on moderation a lot,
Yeah.
is, how I really got into the whole Catholic history of beer. And I think that's one of the things I really try to show in the book, that beer is a Catholic drink.
Right.
And we want to recover that. But one of the ways that we recover that is, I think it'd be a lot of fun just to get guys together, and I've certainly done this, and just start trying some of these beers with a Catholic history. And so I actually give a list of 30 Catholic beers to try in my book. And so I would say, crack open the book. You can also find a definitive list of monastic beers on my website, buildingcatholicculture.com. So you can definitely check that out. But, just get guys together and try some of these great beers. Maybe do the beer blessing that I mentioned, or read a little bit from the Rule of St. Benedict or some other spiritual work, and then try the beers and have a conversation. Hey, what did you think about that? How did it compare to this one? Or look up what foods pair with that beer. So especially cheeses. And some of the breweries, like Chimay, actually makes cheese. And there's some monasteries in the US that make cheese as well. So you can look that up, like Gethsemane makes cheese, but there's a couple of others also. So I would say, create kind of like cultural experiences around beer. You can turn them into even spiritual moments, right? If you're having a good conversation about the spiritual life over a beer. And so that's what I would say when it comes to how can we drink rightly. Let's use beer to gather us together with other Catholics, to have this great experience. Because when I've had moments like that, like good people getting together and really experiencing a good Catholic beer with the food, with conversation, that's a powerful moment. I actually led a beer pilgrimage, and we went to some of the brewing monasteries in Europe. And there were definitely moments like that. Now, that's happened at some events and gatherings in my house in the US. You don't have to go to Belgium to have that experience, but nonetheless, it just stands out of my mind. I'm just thinking of us kind of gathering in the hall at the monastery, drinking the monastery's own beer and cheese, which they made right there. And we're on a pilgrimage, right? And so, you have all the hardships of the pilgrimage, but life is like a pilgrimage, right? And then everything just kind of stops. That's what I remember about those moments, right? Just everything stops. And is it the same experience you have in church, right? No, but it's a different way, I think, of ordering your life to God. And you have an experience there of the Catholic faith that is different than being in church. And our faith should not be just about going to church. There should be all of these other ways to really live out our Catholic faith and to encounter God through culture, I think, as well. It's more indirect. And so I don't want to be accused of heresy here, right? But it's true that there just are these powerful moments that are really, I think, wholesome, and in the sense that there's an earthiness of the beer and the food, but because it's in a spiritual context, it's elevated. And I just get this sense, I'm like, this is a good moment, right? This is good, right? Lord, it is good for us to be here, And so that's what I would say is to really begin looking at alcohol differently. Drop all, the kind of baggage related to it and build better experiences. And I know that is possible because people have said that to me. I've never thought about alcohol this way, or I've never had this kind of really good experience with alcohol like we just did. I always thought alcohol was bad, or it just brought me back to bad memories of the past. But people have said, but now I see it differently. That's a beautiful thing. It's not the end all be all. So that's what I say. The beer option is just one little aspect of the renewal of culture, but we need that to happen, 1,000 times over. And this is one way, kind of bringing about this renewal.
Yeah, it reminds me sort of the Latin phrase "lex orandi, lex credendi." The way we pray is the way we live.
And then lex vivendi.
Which one?
So,
what does that mean?
Yeah, so lex orandi, lex credendi. So the law of prayer is the law of belief,
Mhm.
and then the lex vivendi is the law of life.
Life.
So there's a connection between how we pray, what we believe, and how we live.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I think we've sort of like when Catholic culture really collapsed, sort of, I would say in the 60s, probably, we sort of wanted to wrap every bit of culture sort of into the mass, and I think that's why a lot of novelty, different masses sort of happen, like,
You have to have somewhere to fit the clowns. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah, it's like clowns, guitar, masses, whatever. But versus having a place where you can have culture that is not specifically meant for mass, where you can also make it Catholic.
Mhm.
So I think that,
Absolutely.
that point is really good.
And I think that's how we're going to draw young adults, even closer to the faith. You might say, "Yeah, come with me to church." No, thanks. But hey, come to my house. We're going to drink some monastic beer. All right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
That is so that would be the new evangelization.
Absolutely. And the book, I call it Brew Evangelization. Yeah.
Brew Evangelization. Yes. That's a pretty epic title, I would say. Yeah. Well, I think we're coming to the end for this episode. John, do you have anything to say?
No, it was lovely to meet you, Dr. Stout, and appreciate all you've said, and probably going to take a few from your playbook.
All right. Well, thank you. It was really great talking with you guys too.
Anything else you want to add before we close up?
Cheers. Yeah.
Prosit.
Or yeah, as we say in Latin, prosit.
Prominence et singulis.
Well, thank you everyone for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. And I will put down links to different elements of the episode today, and especially Dr. Stout's book. And who knows, we might have to have a sequel episode if the doctor is willing.
That would be great.
But yeah, have a great rest of your day. Thank you.